All right. So once again, welcome and thank y'all so much for being here for our EduSmart summer workshop series. This series is really designed for all levels of educators, whether you're at a current EduSmart customer or not. We're really just talking and breaking down the new standards that are coming. We'll be using EduSmart content as examples, but this can be applied to any type of content that you have available to you. So it doesn't have to, it's not exclusive to EduSmart. My name is Leah Pinto, and I am the Director of Professional Development here at EduSmart. I was a classroom teacher for way too many years. I mostly taught in middle school, and my background is mostly in STEM. So that was like where my focus was. I'm a graduate of the NASA STEM certification program through the Endeavor program. So that was kind of where I got my start with my my master's in science education and STEM certification. So I really am excited about this topic today. I think it's kind of what I would consider low-hanging fruit. So next year, starting 2024, the new TEKS will be actually applied. Right now, we're just kind of getting ready for them. But there's a lot of changes that are coming with these new TEKS. It's going to be a shift in mindset for how we are able to teach our students. We're taking it from kind of like teaching them the facts of science to teaching them how to figure out science. So it is a big change, and anything we can do to prepare now is going to help us when the new TEKS actually come and all the changes in content that we're going to be doing will be more comfortable and ready. So recurring themes and concepts is definitely one of those things that we can implement early to get that level of comfort. Like, I already have this in place, I'm good to go. And then when the changes come, you've already got this great foundation. Anchoring phenomenon, which was our seminar, our workshop last week, is kind of the same way. It's one of those things we can implement early, have solid in our tool belts when the big content changes come. So that's why we're choosing kind of these like I said, low-hanging fruit to be able to start building in the capacity to accept these new TEKS. This is session 2, so we do ask that you just be present and engaged. We're a small group today. The more interaction you have, the more personalized we can make this for you. So please feel free to ask questions, use the chat, have those discussions. This is very interactive, and we will be asking you to contribute and have those discussions as we go through. So the more we can do that, the more collaborative we can make the experience. And I do ask that you be patient with any technology issues. We tried real hard to time it where, it's perfect. I'm in the middle of a severe thunderstorm right now in my area. So we're just going to cross our fingers that nothing goes wrong there. Today we're going to be talking about our recurring themes for the first time, for the first section of time. We're going to explore these recurring themes and concepts both implicitly and explicitly. So we're looking at them individually as well as blended within content. We'll take a break, and then we'll be spending the rest of this morning doing practical application for your grade level. So this will be a time for really you to take your content and apply what we talked about with the recurring themes, so that when you walk out of here today, you'll be able to immediately apply these recurring themes and concepts to your teaching for next year. And then we'll come back and share any ideas. We'll do a quick Q&A for any questions that you may still have. So why we need to place the context, or we need to place the recurring themes and concepts into some kind of context. So in Texas, we're calling them recurring themes and concepts. Within the NGSS, they're called cross-cutting concepts. They're pretty much exactly the same. And I have a quick video here to help.
Here's your first subject.
Right.
Go.
Gambling,
Did you do the casino?
nightclub, showgirls.
Did you do it at night? No.
Nightclub.
Place you go in Las Vegas?
Yes. Well, they call me a Steinway and
What camera might say?
Liberace. muscular dystrophy, variety club,
Things that have telethons, things that raise money, fundraisers, things that have fundraisers, things that raise money.
The Cancer Foundation,
things that have donations. People want donations.
The Salvation Army,
charities.
yes. The needle, the thread, the petal, the
Parts of a sewing machine.
talking, television, Morse code,
Ways of communication.
yes.
Hurry, Jamie, hurry.
The panic button.
Things you push. Things you hit. Things you press.
Okay, so for those of you not familiar with this show, or those of you who are not of my age, this is an old game show called the $25,000 Pyramid. And on this game show, they would have a celebrity come out and they list these random words. They had to have a list and it had to be in list form. So it was either a word or phrase. And the contestant had to put that word or phrase into a category. Like, what category does all this fall into? So again, it's taking these random concepts that the host just screams out, or that the celebrity screams out, and figuring out what category does it apply to. So this is why we need RTCs. So this is our this random, all this stuff that we teach our students. If we can help them understand how it fits into the bigger picture, we're giving them a framework, a scaffold, a concept that they can put their learning into that already makes sense. So we're giving them a basket and saying, look, yes, this is new content. This is a new thing that you're learning, but it fits in this basket of stuff that you already know. And it helps them to really be able to conceptualize what they've got. So I'm going to show you one more quick example. Now that we kind of understand what that was. And again, this is a very old television show. So for those of you youngins here, it used to be really, really popular and it was very fun to watch. Oops.
I have a feeling this is going to be a good round. He's got himself all hyped up. He's running through every clue he ever heard of. Earl, none of those are going to come up in this game.
Oh, I know.
You're going for $31,100. The best thing I can do is give you a little quiet. So folks in the audience, please don't say anything to one another. We give them a second to catch their breaths. All right. For $25,000, here is your first subject. Go.
Pickles.
Things that are sour.
Yes. Because it's your birthday.
Why you have a party? Why you have a surprise party? Why you celebrate?
Because it's your birthday. Because it's your anniversary.
Why you get presents or gifts?
Yes. Sandpaper.
Things that are rough,
Yes.
scratchy, abrasive.
Yes. Who?
Three-letter words.
Yes. Your mother and father. Your elders.
People you respect.
Yes. Barbara Streisand's nose.
Things that are large. Things that are obtrusive. Things that are
A brat kid's tongue. A pregnant woman's stomach.
things that grow. Things that are large. Things that stick out. Things that
A pregnant woman's stomach.
Things
Barbara
that-
Streisand's nose.
things that protrude.
All right. So again, it's giving that context to this random list of things. Like, how would you connect a pregnant woman's stomach, Barbara Streisand's nose, and a bratty kid's tongue? Well, of course, those are all things that stick out, right? All things that protrude. So, so that is kind of a fun way of using our recurring themes and concepts to understand why we're putting them in like giving our students this tool to be able to understand the world. Another way to see it is that, oh, I spelled that wrong. This is a lens. Sorry, hang on. I got to correct that because that would just bother me. So this is a lens. Oops. Now it's going to start over. Watch, now it doesn't restart. All right, a lens in which we can see the world. So if you think about a concept, any kind of concept, anything that we are teaching our students. So if we're talking about the solar system, we can have a lot of different conversations about the solar system. And it really depends on what we want the students to be able to focus on. What do we want them to be able to conceptualize? Maybe we're looking for patterns. Patterns could be something as simple as the recurring pattern of the revolution that all the planets do. Or it could be looking at where certain planets are located in relation to the sun. So maybe that means the small rocky planets are closer to the sun, whereas our big gaseous giants are further away from the sun. We look for those patterns and be able to maybe then apply that pattern to another solar system. So can we look somewhere else and see the same kind of pattern? And what does that tell us when we start to analyze things? We could also look at it in a systems kind of way. We can look at it in how do all of these things work together within the system. We could look at the flow of energy. Maybe that looks like, photosynthesis, or maybe that looks like waves, like the electromagnetic spectrum. I mean, that you can see the different content that you're teaching as a way of focusing what the students are learning in a way that they already know it. So our recurring themes and concepts are really just a lens that help us to look at this big, huge topics. I mean, the solar system, it's this big, huge thing, and we're looking at it in different ways and being able to craft and mold how the students are seeing it by what lens we choose to give them to look at that. And that is a recurring theme. And yes, there's going to be a lot of overlap between that, right? The energy and matter and energy and photosynthesis, that's all going to be part of that matter and energy lens, but also part of the system lens. And also, there is a lot of overlap, which is a good thing because it allows the students to see how interconnected things are. Not only that, but there's a lot of overlap to other curriculum. So we see patterns in math. We see patterns in social studies. So we're giving them tools that apply outside of just the science classroom. So they can come into our room and this way of looking at the world applies wherever they are in their learning. And that's kind of powerful for our students to have that. We're just, again, giving them tools for how to bring in new concepts and understand those new concepts. There are 7 recurring themes and concepts, and for the most part, they are separated by grade band. We have patterns, scale, proportion, and quantity, cause and effect, systems and system models, energy and matter, structure and function, and stability and change. Now, I think one thing when you see these recurring themes or the RTCs, okay, this is stuff we've been doing forever, right? This is not groundbreaking new information like, oh my gosh, teachers never thought of using structure and function to help students understand the human body, right? Like that, this is not new information. We've been teaching this way for a long time. It's just a matter of taking it and really specifically and deliberately applying it in ways that can grow with the students. So we're going to start this in kindergarten, that they understand that structure and function is a way of looking at the world, and that's going to continue on up all the way through their high school years. So we really want to make it just a little more deliberate, a little more specific as to how things fit into these different baskets. We do need to look at, and we'll be talking about this again after we've covered each of the recurring themes and concepts, but it needs to be taught explicitly. We need to have a direct teach component for the recurring themes and concepts, especially over the next few years as the students are just now learning. When we talk about systems and system models, what on earth does that mean? They're used to hearing the word system when you're talking about a solar system or a body system, but they're not. We need to make sure they understand what is a system and how can it frame their thinking. We need to look at, matter and energy and how does that apply to the world around them. So we need that explicit instruction piece. but it's really designed to also then just be blended in with their learning. And so there has to be both components here. In our workshop today, we're going to start with the explicit teach for each of the RTCs. We're going to go through each of them. We're going to show you an example of how they can be taught to our students and look at like what's practical, like the practical applications of this particular recurring theme. And then we're going to look at ways that we can start blending it in with their context and their content information. So we're really going to do both of those today. And that way you can kind of see how, it's a model of how do we want to expose our students to this new information, this new way of learning. So we're going to, this is just a quick overall view. This is the vertical alignment piece for all of our recurring themes and concepts. You'll notice that almost across the board, there with just two little exceptions that I will mention, K through 2 is all going to be the same. 3 through 5 is going to be the same. And then 6 through 8 is all the same. Now, biology does not include the recurring themes and concepts. They're kind of built into what they do. But obviously these can apply to all the different science, like different types of science. It can be physics or chemistry or earth science or whatever it is. And so only some of these would specifically apply to biology, which is what EduSmart offers. But when you get into those high school level TEKs, it's kind of built into what they're already doing. So the actual recurring themes and concepts end at 8th grade. So K2 all has exactly the same wording and like level of rigor, the verbiage that they need to understand. 3 through 5 has the same, and then 6 through 8 is going to be exactly the same. So they're going to learn this at this level for multiple years. We're going to start with patterns. Like we're just going to go straight through the TEKs A through G. 5A is patterns. When we're talking about patterns, of course, a pattern is a recurring or repeated arrangement or a sequence of objects, events, or characteristics. Kindergarteners here are just asked to identify patterns and describe phenomenon. So use these patterns to describe phenomenon. Day-night cycle, right? There's a pattern. The sun comes up, the sun goes down. The moon comes up, the moon goes down. Like there's a pattern to day and night. There's a pattern to seasons. There's patterns in nature, life cycles, things like that. So that's all they have to do. When we get up to our older upper elementary level, now we're using these patterns, identify and using the patterns for not only the scientific phenomenon, but also engineering solutions. So now we're going to use a pattern to design an engineering solution, and I'll show you what that looks like in a second. And it really stays the same throughout 8th grade. So patterns is it's kind of a big bucket, right? This one's a really big basket. Like there's patterns everywhere, and these patterns occur across the board and a lot. So this one can really relate to almost all the other recurring themes as well as all the different content. And I'm going to show you an example of how this would look. Now, again, in EduSmart, our direct teach component, our explicit instruction is our instruction module. So for those of you not familiar with this, it's like a short video, 8 to 12 minutes tops, that has built-in pauses where there's question prompts for us to then discuss what information has been presented so far. So it's very collaborative and interactive. So we have them broken down into different grade levels, and I'm going to be showing this particular one is going to be 6th through 8th grade. I'll also show some from 3rd and 5th grade and K2. So it's going to be lots of examples of how you can instruct the students on these. So this is going to take me straight to our instruction module.
The periodic table shows all the elements ever discovered at one glance. But why are the elements arranged in this order?
So now we have a pause where we can start to talk about why is it in this particular order? Do we know how it's organized? Depending on the grade level, the students will not have learned about the periodic table yet. So they should have heard about it. They should be aware of its existence, but they may not have known like breakdown of exactly how it's arranged or why it's arranged the way it is.
The table follows a pattern found in the atomic number of the elements. What is a pattern?
And now we talk about patterns. We have that break. And this time I would do with my students maybe like a think, pair, share. We could do a shoulder partner talk. We could start a KWL chart. Like I would actually have something that I'm writing and we're talking about it as we go, maybe an anchor chart for a pattern.
A pattern is something that repeats itself many times. It can also be a shape or an activity.
So here we're giving them the definition, what is a pattern, but we're also applying it to other things. And like the students are mostly going to think of patterns as being shapes, things that they see in math, you know, that consistent, like different equations and things like that. So we want them to understand it can be more than just something very physical in front of them.
The patterns in the periodic table, like the atomic number, electron configuration, and chemical properties, allowed scientists to predict properties of elements that were discovered later, like germanium for example.
Now we're giving another example.
Patterns can be seen all over in nature, such as the spiral. They can be seen in animal shells, plants, and even in space. Migration of many animals also follows patterns based on seasons. The Canadian geese migration pattern starts in spring when they move from their wintering grounds in Canada to their breeding grounds in the southern United States and Mexico.
I think a big key here is that when you're doing the explicit instruction, you want to make sure you're including examples from all the different types of science, especially now that in middle school, we're really mixing up the content for the new 2024 TEKS. Used to be 7th grade was basically an island of life science, and then we taught all the other kind of science in 6th and 8th grade. In the new TEKS, it's going to be mixed up more. So every grade level is going to be teaching every kind of science. And so it's important to give them examples of different types of patterns that you would see in chemistry, in earth science, in life science, and in physical science or physics. So this particular video takes several examples from different types of science, and that's a great way to really make sure that they see it as something across the board that they can apply their learning to.
Biologists study the migration patterns of Canadian geese and other animals to better understand their behavior and environmental conditions. Such patterns help biologists to find and predict changes like impact of climate change, interaction between different species, habitat loss, and degradation. What patterns can you observe around you?
Now, this would be another great chance for the students to be talking. This would be creating our anchor chart in class. Tell me about some patterns that you can think of. And it might be difficult at first, you know, especially over the first couple of years of implementation. This might be really hard for the kids. They're not used to thinking in big picture kind of ways. We're used to giving them facts and they learn about this piece of content and then we move to this piece of content and then we move to this piece of content. So this is going to be an overarching kind of theme, and it might be a little more difficult for them to have that. What kind of patterns can you think of? And they may pull in things from other types of content. You know, maybe they pull in those math patterns that they would see, and that's great because then you're giving them a connection to the world outside of the science classroom.
Today we learned that the table follows a pattern found in the atomic number of the elements. Spiral patterns can be seen all over in nature. Migration of many animals follows patterns based on seasons. Patterns help biologists to find and predict things like impact of climate change, interaction between different species, habitat loss and degradation.
So the key takeaways here are we have these great patterns. Now, how do we use them? Well, scientists use patterns to do things like make predictions. I know what cycle of the moon is coming next because I know the pattern of the moon cycle. So making predictions is huge. Discovering the underlying principles, things like natural selection and selective breeding. Those are patterns that they're identifying. We can compare things easily, and then by using the pattern, if something falls outside of that pattern, now I have an anomaly and I can really start to investigate that. So we want to give the students ways that scientists use this type of learning, this big basket of patterns, to really help them understand the world. And this is what patterns are really great at. In our content, these are just some few examples of ways or places in your scope and sequence that you might use patterns as a recurring theme to help the students understand. So life cycles, periodic table, geological formations, weather patterns, obviously climate patterns. Anything in the solar system is going to follow some kind of pattern. Genetics is a great one, and waves and sound. Now, I'm not giving you these to like limit or say, this is the standards that you should use patterns to teach, because I can use so many of the recurring themes on any of these different topics. So these are just suggestions and kind of the ways to start that thinking process of how are we going to apply this knowledge. But please don't take this as a limiting list. It's not a list of the ones that should be used, or it's only a list of possible uses to be able to incorporate those recurring themes and patterns. Any questions on patterns? How are we doing so far? Is that making sense? Putting it in the right basket? Awesome. I love the thumbs up. Thank you. Cool. Okay, so we're going to be doing this for each of the 7 patterns. That way you get a really great example of what it looks like and how we instruct our students in it, and then practical examples of what types of content, not only what types of content, but why do scientists use this recurring theme, and then how we can apply it in ours. So next up, 5.B is cause and effect. And I would honestly say this one of all of the recurring themes is probably the most widely used. Let's say I can literally apply this to anything, right? It's like there's always going to be a cause and there's always going to be effect. It affects systems, it affects changes, it affects energy and matter. All of those things are there's a cause and effect. So this is kind of ubiquitous, honestly. But it is still a great way for our students to be thinking about how they can arrange new learning, how they can scaffold new learning to make sense to them in their world. And a question from the chat on those vertical alignment documents, I will include a link to the vertical alignment docs. We share those freely. So when you get after the webinar, you'll get a copy of the webinar, the slide deck that goes with it, and I will also make sure and include the vertical alignment documents, that link, so that you can have access to that as well. So I'm just going to make a quick note. They're really great virtual alignment documents. They're just really clear and simple. So we'll make sure you get those. All right, so again, we're going to go to 6th through 8th grade for this particular instruction module. Just because it kind of goes a little bit more in depth into, and I want to go back to cause and effect. In this case, all we're doing at the lowest grade levels is talking about that cause and effect relationship. So if I push something, it moves. Cause, effect. Here, the key is we want to be able to predict the cause and effect. So what's going to happen if you push on that box? Well, it's going to move. Like, we're making that assumption based on what we know has happened in the past. Once we move up to 3rd and 5th grade, it's kind of the same. We're using that, identifying the cause and effect to then explain the relationship between a phenomenon and analyze problems. So this would be what caused the deer population in this ecosystem to explode. Well, the effect is that deer population exploded. So what was the cause of that? Well, we took all the wolves out of the ecosystem or whatever. We're looking for that explanation of why something happened. In the beginning, all we want to do is be able to understand that there is a relationship and it is causal, right? And then afterwards we use that, we use it to explain the relationships between objects. So I'm going to go real quick.
We know that hot air rises, but what causes this?
And again, this is where we have those built-in pauses where you would have the discussion with your students to keep it interactive.
When air is heated, the molecules have more energy and spread further apart. This makes hot air less dense than cold air, so it rises. What determines the outcome of a sports match?
Now we relate it back to something in their own world, something that they can really concrete grab onto.
There could be multiple causes that determine the outcome. The causes could be the skill of players, weather conditions, or strategies used by a team. Knowing the possible causes helps predict the outcome or effect. A healthy player would execute his skills better than an injured player. If a team does not win, then the coaches analyze the game, make predictions, and change their instructions according to the opponent's strategy and skill set of the players. Poor weather conditions would affect sports that are played outdoors. If the playing conditions are slippery, it will be harder for players to maintain their balance and control. Weather conditions nowadays are affected by global warming. One of the major causes of global warming is the excess burning of fossil fuels. The negative effects of global warming include melting of glaciers, rise in sea level, and severe weather events. What are some other effects of global warming?
So again, we've taken it from something very concrete that they can understand and see, and they're out on the soccer field or the football field, and they understand, that these are things that happen on the field that can affect the outcome of the game. And then we take it to that abstract level where we're applying the same concept to something that they can't necessarily see or feel, especially something like this that's either global or that's time related, where it's changes in time over a long period.
There could be multiple causes that determine the outcome. Knowing the possible causes helps predict the outcome or effect. Weather conditions nowadays are affected by global warming.
So it's just a real simple example of how there's multiple causes. We don't want to limit it to them understanding just one cause. So we want to look at, especially if this is a 6th through 8th grade example. So how complex that cause and effect relationship can be, and maybe even take it to the next step or two. So if we're talking about something about a food web or an ecosystem, and you're talking about how energy flows, what happens when the wolves are removed, that has long-lasting consequences that have one effect that then causes another effect and causes another effect, and we can really take it deep down that road. So for scientists, some of these practical uses is certainly to make predictions. If you live in an area where there are tectonic plates that meet, probably there's going to be some geological activity that happens there. Like we can predict where activity is going to happen or predict weather patterns based on that cause and effect component. I also like this. It gives us a way to develop interventions. So we know that because there's a force being applied to something, that there is going to be a change in that object. So how do we fix that? If we wanted to change that, how do we change the effects that humans are having on an ecosystem? That's in the new TEKS, that's going to be a big component, is that conservation and making appropriate use of natural resources. So that intervention piece is super important. It also allows us to design experience and then analyze relationships. Within our TEKS now, practical uses here would be anything to do with Newton's laws. Of course, we're talking cause and effect. Again, that interdependence in ecosystems, weather and climate, and then natural selection and selective breeding. Or I guess it's now going back to being called artificial selection. Pick one, I think. But these are all practical ways that you can apply cause and effect. Moving on to scale, proportion, and quantity, number. So this one's really important because we also have to include time as one of the quantities or part of the scale. So many of the science TEKS involve changes over time and seeing how those changes happen. And it could be short amount of time, it could be long periods of time, hundreds of years, it could be thousands of years, it could be billions of years if you're talking about the evolution of galaxies or solar systems. So that time scale is a really important component of this particular recurring theme and pattern. There is one little difference here in the grade bands. So kinder and first says describe the properties of objects in terms of relative size and relative quantity. And second grade then goes on to measure. So now for second grade, we have that describe and measure. And it's that's one of the very few exceptions. So in our earliest grade levels, we really just want like larger and smaller, or bigger and taller and shorter, more or less. Like that's all we need is that relative size. And then as you get up into the older grade levels, we can start adding numbers to that. Now we're actually going to measure something. And this is this apple is this tall while this apple is this tall. Like it's just moving, giving it a little bit more definition. And then once we move into the upper grade levels, now we're going to use that scale, proportion, and quantity to describe and compare models of different systems, and then on into how it affects a structure's performance. And I'll give you an example of this. Oh, sorry, I forgot to change the C. Yes, this is 5.C, scale, proportion, and quantity. In fact, I'll just go ahead and change that right now. And sorry, this is C. Oops, and I did the wrong thing again. I hate doing that from the beginning. All right, and this example, we're going to use our kindergarten through second grade because it's tough to really help our littlest learners understand that scale and proportion quantity. So in this example, this is designed for the kindergarten first grade levels or grade band.
Why is walking a dog easier than running with it?
And again, we have that built-in pause, and you can imagine, you can kind of hear the conversation that your kids would be able to have around such a simple question as this. But again, we're already starting with that easier or harder, the proportion that helps the kids to really understand that scale and proportion feature.
Dogs run faster than most humans. How do we know dogs run faster than people? We can see them run faster with our eyes, but we also use numbers to understand better. Let's say a human runs 5 steps for some time. The dog runs 10 steps in the same time. The number which tells us how much there is of something is called quantity. 10 steps are 5 steps and another 5 steps. The dog takes twice or double the steps. If the human takes 1 step, how many steps would the dog take for the same time?
So again, we've given that explicit definition of what quantity is, and then we're also exploring the proportion between the two.
The dog takes twice or double the steps. Twice or double of 1 step is 2 steps. When we compare such quantities, it is called scale. Scale can also be used to compare sizes of objects, the number of objects, and more. Which treat do you think the dog would choose?
And here we can have our conversation again with the littles going, oh, I want the big treat.
The dog is smart. It can tell the differences in size. What do you think is the scale of these treats?
And so again, here we're having them make predictions and try and quantify. We're adding that bigger, smaller, and then we start building into adding actual numbers to that scale quality.
The larger treat is 3 times the size of the small treat. The dog understands quantity too. She knows there are more treats in the bag. There are 6 slices of apples. 2 are for the dog. The human and the dog eat the same quantity of apple slices every day for 3 days. Even though they had a lot of slices over 3 days, each day the quantity of slices each had is the same. When quantities change in a relationship, we call it a proportion. Proportion tells us how quantities change when they are compared to one another. If the dog has more apple slices on the 4th day, the proportion of slices that the dog had will change and go up. Today, we learned that the number which tells us how much there is of something is called quantity. Scale can be used to compare quantities, sizes of objects, the number of objects, and more. Proportion tells us how quantities change when they are compared to one another.
So just real simple kid-friendly definitions of each of those terms and how they can be applied in a very, very concrete way, because we need to keep it concrete for our littlest learners. Now, as it evolves, of course, for the older level learners, you're going to go much more into specific detail and how we find our proportions. It's going to relate it back to those math type questions. Come on, catch up. Sorry, got to get back to where we were because I hit the wrong button. Almost there. All right. So for some practical uses, again, it's going to be able to provide that consistent framework, and it allows one of the really important things that we can emphasize with our students. Anytime you're analyzing data and communicating your findings, we need to make sure we're using the same scale, right? So this is where that whole standard units of measure versus the metric system would come in. Like, we have to understand those same if I communicate with someone across the world, do we understand that we're using the same language here for math? We obviously make comparisons, so things like catastrophic events, where we're comparing the damage done by a hurricane or how the hurricane would affect an ecosystem, and then finding patterns. This particular standard relates more to that data analysis piece than any of the others. So it's really important to be able to find those patterns within our data. And then to establish relationships between items. So for our youngest learner, again, it's simply classifying objects. Anything to do with measurement is going to pull in this recurring theme. That hierarchical comparison, so we're talking levels of organization, and then anything that's going to do with time. So when we're talking about geologic time, we're talking about formation of the solar system, changes over time, like slow changes versus fast changes in weathering, erosion, and deposition. All of those changes of time, that's going to pull in this recurring theme. And so we can continue to emphasize scale, proportion, and quantity throughout any kind of discussion of time. So does anybody have any questions on any of the recurring themes so far? Just want to make sure we have that clear understanding, like this is that direct teach component within each of the recurring themes, so that we're super familiar with the recurring themes, and then we'll start blending them with our content. Awesome. All right, feel free to, chime in with your questions at any time. Moving on to systems and system models. This standard is, one of the big things here is that we want to expand our kids' thinking into a system model, and systems occur within systems, So a lot of times what we're doing is just starting small and then building out into the largest system. The Earth itself can be viewed as a system, but of course there's many systems within our planet that interact with each other. So I can look at the Earth as a system, the atmosphere, the biosphere, the hydrosphere, all of those are systems, and then they relate to the larger system. So for our youngest learners, it's really key that they understand that parts of a whole relationship. All they need to be able to understand in those first grade levels is how do pieces of something relate to the whole? So how does arms become part of an organism? Organisms have parts. They have arms, they have legs, they have eyes, they have, all these different parts. So that part to whole relationship. As they go upper levels, we then examine the parts and talk about the interdependence and the function of the system. So what happens if some of the parts are removed? What happens if the parts are changed? How do the parts rely on each other? How do they interact with each other? Thinking about weather and climate, how does the wind interact with the ocean to form different types of weather events or whatever that happens to be? Another key part of this component is understanding the limitations of models. So at this point, we build models to examine things that are too complex for us to really get a good grasp on without being able to see the model of it. If you don't see a model of the solar system, it's really, really hard to understand what a solar system is. Like, it's just too complex. But when we start making models of the solar system, we lose something in it. Like we can look at the scale of it, and how far the planets are apart from each other. But we're having to do that on a condensed scale. So then you lose the size. So we can talk through what are those limitations of a model while still keeping the value of the model. So we have to use models to be able to visualize these difficult concepts, but all models have problems. All of them are going to have limitations. And so being able to understand those limitations is super important. So we're going to look at this. This is a middle grade, 3rd through 5th, looking at systems and system models. It kind of takes, it's a little bit of a step down from what they would learn at the upper level, just with the interdependence piece, but otherwise looks at the parts in a whole.
Our planet Earth is a part of the solar system, along with the other planets and their moons. Why is the solar system called a system?
Most of our students are probably not going to even have considered the system model or system like component of a solar system, right? That's just what you call it. That's the name of it. They don't necessarily think of why it's called a system. And so especially in the first few years of implementation with this, when we're explicitly teaching them what a system is, it's going to change that definition a little bit for them. It's going to change the way they look at things that are defined as a system, like a solar system or an ecosystem.
A system is made of parts. The parts of a system all work together to do a task. From Earth, we cannot see all the planets of our solar system with just our eyes. The other planets are very large and far away. To see how they form part of the system, we use a model of the solar system. Models help us understand how a system and its parts work with each other. Models can be used for large systems and objects, or for smaller ones, such as a car. A car is a system made of many parts: the wheels, engine, doors, and more. These parts work together and help the car move. We can look at the parts closely and see how the parts work together using a model. An ecosystem is another example of a system with many parts. A diorama of dinosaurs can be used as a model to learn about ecosystems. The model has ancient plants. It shows how the parts of this prehistoric ecosystem worked together.
So I like in this how it explains why we need the concept of a system and how that works. Then it takes it through a very concrete example, more of a more of a difficult to understand concept for a student at that size, that scale proportion, and then how a model would actually work to help explain something like an ecosystem. So it really works through that concrete and then the abstract and then the practical piece. And I think that's kind of the key to a lot of these recurring themes, is that practical application.
Today, we learned that a system is made of parts. The parts of a system all work together to do a task. Models help us understand how a system and its parts work with each other.
All right, so when we look at this on the practical level, scientists would use these systems and parts of a system to really analyze super complex phenomenon. So if it's something that we can take and look at, like the climate change or huge climate patterns, then we can look at each individual component of that and try and make sense of why those changes are happening. That also helps to understand and predict what's going to happen next. So we take the pieces and use that to find the pattern. And once you have a pattern, you can start to make predictions. And then it also helps us to recognize interconnectedness. And that's fairly key to, when we're talking about a solar system and you look at the interconnectedness, the gravity, and how things work together with within the solar system, we really want to be able to take that knowledge that we have, because we can't go to the next solar system. So we have to be able to apply some kind of model that will help us understand something that we can't actually physically get to be able to examine with our hands, right? So that interconnectedness is super important. For us, as far as our standards, we think of it a lot of times in body systems, weather and climate systems, ecosystems, solar systems, but also things like electric circuits are going to be very system-based, because, and that parts of a whole, you know, if we take out one part of an electric circuit, we lose the circuit working, you know, when you're talking about things like that, the parts to a whole is going to be very important. So we're a little over halfway through our 7 recurring themes and concepts. The next one is energy and matter. And what we're really looking at here is forms of energy and properties of matter. So this one is another one where it's slightly different for one grade level. Like they had to pull out one word just to make it a little bit different. But we're recognizing the movement of matter and energy, looking at how it works in cycles, and then we're looking at the principles of conservation that govern them. So things like the laws of conservation of matter, the laws of conservation of energy and momentum. So kinder through second is identify forms of energy and properties of matter. All we need to do is be able to know them and name them. Once you get to 3rd grade, we investigate the flow of energy and the cycling of matter through systems. And there's a slight difference between these, and I don't have that listed. I will find that in just a moment. And then when we get up to the older grade levels, it's analyze and explain how energy flows and matter cycles through systems, and how energy and matter are conserved through a variety of systems. So we then start to not just understand how it's moving, how matters and energy are moving in and out of a system, but how they are conserved through a variety of topics. So we're talking decomposers, things along that line. This is our middle example again of what do the students need to know on this level for matter and energy.
Did you know that you just need a spoonful of sugar to make this cotton candy?
Oh, and you can just hear the conversations that would be going on around cotton candy. So we've given them this phenomenon of cotton candy to be able to relate this topic to.
Sugar is made of matter. Matter can be transformed from one form to another. It can neither be created nor be destroyed. The total amount of matter remains the same. What happens when you add sprinkles to this cotton candy? It forms a mixture. The total mass of the mixture is the added mass of the sprinkles and the cotton candy. When you eat cotton candy, you get energy to do different activities. But where does the energy in the food come from? The energy in the food comes from the sun. Light energy from the sun is transformed and stored as food in plants. When organisms eat the plants, the energy is transferred to them. Energy is also transferred and stored in your system through the food you eat. Energy always flows from the sun to organisms. We use arrows to show the direction of flow of energy. When an organism dies, bacteria and fungi transfer the matter from the organism back to the ecosystem. Matter cycles from the dead organisms into the soil and then back into the plant. All objects that have matter also have energy. Energy does not cycle, it always flows in one direction. This is why energy from the sun is so important. Energy can change the property of matter. The flow of energy helps run the cycle of matter within an ecosystem. This flow of energy and cycling of matter is important for the functioning of an ecosystem.
All right, so So again, we're talking about the flow of energy and then the cycling of matter, and being able to identify that and then show how it moves through. Uh-oh. Oh, lights going out there. How it moves through an ecosystem or through another type of system. The practical uses here, like scientists would use this to understand both conservation and sustainability. It's really important that we be able to yeah, I agree. Yeah, the cotton candy is a great example. I love that picture of the kids eating the cotton candy too. It's just fun. But yeah, so being able to understand how a system functions, being able to make predictions, and then really analyze those systems and cycles. All of those are really important topics when you're talking about energy, and especially matter, and being able to know what's going to happen. So we have, for example, the law of conservation of energy, the law of conservation of mass, but it also applies when you're talking about Newton's laws, like the conservation of momentum, moving through, you know, that energy component. So, and those are going to be really big in middle school. It's going to be covered throughout middle school starting in 2024. 1 year each, you cover one of Newton's laws. We also talk about it a lot when we start talking about the carbon cycle and the nitrogen cycle, as well as water cycles. So it'll be very helpful knowing that flow of matter. And of course, you can see how these are overlapping, right? We can see how the recurring themes are really overlapping when we talk about the forms of energy, the flow of energy, the cycling of matter. Now we're getting into that system type thing where it's a closed system. And when we talk about patterns, how, you know, the water cycle is kind of a pattern and things happen over and over again. So you really start to intertwine all the different recurring themes and help it to understand, you know, help your students to understand that they're able to place this new content that they learn, like, oh my gosh, what do you mean there's a carbon cycle too? Yeah, but think about what you know about the water cycle. So let's apply what we know about the water cycle and how the cycle works and how that energy is conserved and all those things to this new level of learning. Ecosystems is a great example for this, because when we're learning about ecosystems throughout the grade levels, it's really just increasing complexity. And so once they have that foundation of what is a system, how energy flows in the system, now we're just adding level after level after level of complexity into their understanding of how an ecosystem works. So that energy and matter are continued through every level of the type of learning that they do. So that one's kind of another one that, I mean, everything takes energy and everything is made of matter. So that one is heavily intertwined with all of the different content that they are going to learn. One of my favorite, just because I taught 7th grade for many years, and that structure and function, like, you know, I harped on that all year long. We drew puzzle pieces left and right. We always had that structure drives function and function explains structure. So that constant reinforcing of structure and function works on every grade level, of course. We want to describe, in the lowest grade levels, we want to describe the relationship between structure and function. And that really kind of continues through all of 5th grade, because you're just getting more complex objects that you're describing. But then when we get on into middle school, it's more about analyzing how structure and function relate to each other. So if something, that's more like adaptations. How does this shape of wing help this bird to have this particular function? And we really want to begin to lead them to understand that this function drives the structure, and the structure drives the function, not just how they relate to each other. So for this one, we're going to look at it at the earliest level. This is our K2 band of how structure and function work together. And again, you really want to give them that foundational definition, and then just be able to introduce concrete ways that they relate to each other. And my internet or my lights started flickering just a little bit, so I'm afraid the storm may have gotten me. They have made my internet reset. It did come back, so I'm hoping it comes back up. There we go, pretty quickly.
How would you describe a spider's web?
So at this point, again, we can start our anchor chart. We can start that conversation, all kinds of describing words.
They look like small nets made in a wheel or a star shape. How we describe an object's shape is the structure. Why do spiders spin webs? Spiders spin webs to catch insects for food. What an object is used for is called its function. How would you describe the structure and function of a cave? Caves are hollow structures sometimes used by animals for shelter. Why do rose bushes have thorns? They have thorns to protect them from being eaten by animals. Why do eagles have sharp talons? Sharp talons help the eagles to hold their food tightly while flying. How does the structure of a toy car help in its function? A toy car has wheels that go round and round. They are held together by the body of the car. Together they form a system. This helps the car move. The shape of the structure tells its function. What are some other structures and their functions around you?
And I like the way it ends with this open conversation, because the students can really start applying it to like everything. Like I have a pencil sitting in front of me. How does that structure and function work together? Like it's really super simple terminology for even the youngest learners. It gives them that concrete definition and then immediately starts to apply it in a huge variety of ways. So this one's a great one, like I said, very foundational for the kids. And then it's just become so much more complex as they go. And things like cells and cell structure and function, organelles, body systems, all of those things. And when you really start getting into the levels of natural selection and selective breeding, it becomes really important to understand that structure and function piece. So for scientists, they use structure and function, of course, just to analyze its functionality. Like, there's great activities out there where you hand a kid like some kind of object and have them find ways to use it and everything except for what it's designed for. Like give them a fork and say, figure out 5 different ways that you can use this object, and they can do that. Where an adult would actually struggle with that. Like there's really great studies that show that kids have more of an imagination for that. So for our youngest learners, really being able to problem solve using that functionality is a great way of getting them to understand structure and function. Of course, just understanding design principles, that engineering component, structure and function is everything when it comes to engineering. And then you can use those structures and functions to start making predictions. So of course, the classic example is the Charles Darwin and the finches and the shape of the beak driving what that animal was going to eat. And you could actually make that prediction based on the shape of the beak or the shape of their feet. So for practical uses, of course, human body systems
Oh, I think my cat.
Unplugged my microphone. Is that better? Can you hear me now? Are we good again? Okay, good. Right. So yeah, like I was saying, anything to do with engineering, of course, is going to be huge for structure and function. And with our new 2024 TEKS that are coming, engineering is a big piece of that. So they're adding the component, like we're not just learning about science, we're also using how to apply science. And that engineering component is applied science. So that structure and function piece will be huge for that. And our very last one of our recurring themes and concepts is stability and change. And of course, this is going to relate back to things like systems and energy and things like that. For our grade levels, we're talking at our youngest grade levels, we want to just really understand that things change and things stay the same. And maybe what can affect that? What can make something start to change? How does, days, seasons, things like that, the stability and change factors there. And then we move up to being able to explain how those factors really create or impact change in stability. And then notice the verb level here, analyze and explain. So now we want to look at not only what is the impact of a change or stability, but analyze in detail how things are changing with like within an ecosystem or an invasive species. Catastrophic events would be great examples of that stability and change. So for this one, again, we went through the middle grade levels for 3 through 5. For stability and change. Oh, come on, internet, don't fail me now. There we go.
This cyclist is moving at the same speed on the same path. We call this a stable system because everything seems to stay the same for some time. How do you think this system can change? If the cyclist cycles with more force, the cycle will move faster. Their speed now is a change in the system. How did this change the stability in the system? The system remains stable because everything still remains the same, but at the new speed. Stability and change can be seen around you, even in organisms such as butterflies. Butterflies do not always look so colorful and pretty. Caterpillars hatch from eggs before becoming butterflies. The life cycle of an organism, such as a butterfly, has stability. Why is the life cycle of an organism considered stable? An organism changes its structure as it goes through different stages.
Uh-oh. Sorry. Internet reset.
This cyclist is moving at the...
Sorry, let me catch back up where we were there.
The moon may look different every night, but the pattern of the phases never changes. It always goes through the full cycle from full moon phase to the new moon phase. Objects, organisms, and systems may experience changes, but can have overall stability.
And I think that this is a real key point within the recurring theme for stability and change, is that stability in a system does not mean it's not changing. We can have dynamic change within a system and it is still very stable. So, and that's a real common misconception. The kids have a difficulty understanding that a stable system is still changing. It's just changing in a predictable way. And so, when you're introducing this concept of stability and change, it's important how this one's going to be a little tougher than some of the others, because it's really important how we present it to the students. at our youngest grade levels, being able just to predict the seasons and the changes of seasons, that is a stable change. So having that system that is continually changing, even though we consider it stable, that's going to be really confusing for some of our learners. And so it's really important how we introduce that stability versus change factor.
Today we learned that we call a system stable because everything seems to stay the same for some time. Stability and change can be seen in many things around you. Objects, organisms, and systems may experience changes but can have overall stability.
So again, that key point of even though things are changing, they are overall stable. And then when you get up into the upper grade levels, it's a matter of, now, wait a minute. So things have changed. What causes it to no longer be stable? What are we looking at that has affected the system to the point that it is not stable anymore? So what might that be? I mean, if you're talking about a solar system, maybe we have an asteroid or a comet that comes in and impacts a planet and moves it or has some kind of effect on that planet. Venus is always a great example of that because, Venus is rotating the wrong direction counterclockwise because of an impact. So there's lots of ways that you can show how change affects that stability piece. So stability allows us to really find patterns. And once you have a pattern, of course, we can start to make predictions. But then we need to make sure that the students understand dynamic change versus instability. When we find change, it may be just part of the pattern of that ecosystem that goes through yearly changes. But if you start to see anomalies, something not working, something changing that doesn't ever go back, now we have instability in an ecosystem or instability in a solar system or some kind of pattern change. Engineering design, of course, this is huge. We want to make sure that you're designing stable structures and like we're talking maybe earthquakes or something like that, things are going to change. The ecosystem is going to change around the structure. How do we create stability within that structure? Feedback loops are another really good example of that stability and change. There's always that the input and then a response. So that stimulus response factor creating either stability or something wrong. Like if you're talking about the human body systems and there's a virus and now we have a fever and the unit, the system, the human body system is no longer stable because something has changed in that equilibrium factor. So being able to describe that is key, but again, it's super important of how we're going to explain it to know that change is good, change is fine. It's okay to have changes. It's just, that doesn't mean a system is not stable. And then at other times, change does cause instability within the system. So, of course, talking about ecosystems and communities, I like this where we're talking about changes of states of matter, succession and catastrophic events, again, homeostasis and equilibrium, but Newton's laws, when we're talking about physics and we're talking about things that cause change, of course, work, forces, all of that can be interwoven with when an object is stable, when it's at rest, it's going to stay at rest. When it's in motion, it's going to stay in motion. And how does change affect that? And then waves are another example of using that stability factor in physics, in a physics kind of setting like the electromagnetic spectrum. So there's lots of different ways that these can be used to show how things either remain stable or changing, constant dynamic change. With that said, we do want to take a look kind of at that explicit versus blended. So what we've done up until now is very explicit instruction. We are teaching the recurring themes directly so that we know how and where and when they can be applied. And again, I want to say, we gave you some great suggestions, but that does not mean it's the only topic that can be taught with that specific TEK. There's lots of standards that can go with each of the recurring themes. And it may be that at some point you want to change that. You know, you can use multiple recurring themes to really approach the students. That's an easy differentiator to be able to get the correct lens, right? Because we're talking about like a lens for how the students are going to learn. But we also want the recurring themes just to be included with the content standard. So as I'm teaching a specific piece of content, I want them to automatically be able to scaffold this using that understanding that we have built, that contextual understanding. And so how might that look? What is it going to look like to blend the recurring theme and content in with our instruction? So imagine you're using whatever content unit we're going through, and as you're doing that, you're pointing out to the students where these recurring themes might fit. So I'm going to use EduSmart examples for this, but they're like simple examples that can be replicated for it, you know, if you don't have the EduSmart resources, like you can find anchoring phenomenon in other places. We just kind of have done all the work for you there. So to start with, we're going to weave this, this recurring theme in from the very beginning of our instruction. So starting with the 5E lesson cycle, we want to use an anchoring phenomenon. This is our engaged piece. We want to create a shared experience with our students that we would then be able to go back to over and over again as we go through the unit, right? So that we're giving them something to a real world example of how this type of phenomenon will work. And this is a a solar system example. So we're talking about it's time to line up. At the beginning of my unit, I'm going to show them this piece of content. And all it's doing is showing me a picture of the solar system and how the planets revolve around the sun and the order that they're in. I can start to look for different patterns. Maybe at this point we could include other types of recurring themes. So I might look at things like relative size. I might look for forms of energy. We might even be able to look at how things are changing and how they stay the same. One thing I would point out with my students is if I'm doing this with them, I'm going to say, this is a great model of the solar system, but is it exactly accurate? We might have that discussion about, yeah, this is a great model because it shows all the planets, but it doesn't show how far apart they are. There's a limitation to this model, and that's a big limitation for this particular piece of content. To show you, so this was, just 1 second, that was grade 4. So I'm going to go to grade 4. I'm going to go to that particular standard. And that was, I think it was that one, changing season of moon phases. With each of those, we always include a teacher document that is going to give you questions to get started, because the point of an anchoring phenomenon is to get the kids asking questions. And so for that anchoring phenomenon, I want the kids asking questions about the solar system. I want them asking questions about the planets. I want them asking what makes them go around like that? Why are some of them bigger than others? And how far out could they go and still have that pull towards the sun? Like, there's a ton of questions that you might want your kids asking about this. And we're talking about, the order of the planets and all of those components of the solar system. And I can bring in from the very beginning these themes. So what kind of patterns do you see? What is the relationship between the size and the scale of this model? I could use parts of a whole. Each of these planets and the sun are parts of the solar system. Like, I can bring in any of those examples, and it really just depends which one I would use based on what I want my students to be noticing. Another example would be a reader. This is patterns in the sky. And we're talking, this is a first grade reader. So if we're learning about patterns and we're talking about the day-night cycle, this is a great example of a way that I can blend it in. I'm using this pattern of day-night to really reinforce to my students that this happens over and over again, even though sometimes we can't see the sun, it's still there, it goes down and out. I'm giving them the basket of patterns to be able to understand that things happen over and over again. And it's foundational for the students, knowing that patterns occur over and over and over again, so that when we do get into more complex things like seasons and the moon phases or something like that, we can still understand that pattern connection. So readers like this, journals, journal prompts and engineering design challenges. So when we start the 2024 TEKS, the engineering design is going to be a huge component. So next week's workshop is going to be on the science and engineering practices. And it's really taking what we already do with our process skills and adding that engineering component. So again, we're not just learning about the content of science now, we're learning how to apply science in engineering. And so these engineering design challenges or projects are great ways to bring in those recurring themes and concepts. So this is a quick example from second grade. You need to have some kind of make it component in your classroom. Our kids need to be creating, they need to be building. And so as I'm teaching, this particular TEK is small units like building blocks. This is one of the new TEKs coming, but it can of course be applied to any of the standards that you're already teaching in your classroom. We're learning how we can use the materials we already have to create something new, like a transformer in real life, and it's materials based on their physical properties. Notice here, anything 2.5 is one of the recurring themes and concepts. So this particular, in this one challenge, I can get in cause and effect, I can get in size, relative size, quantity, and scale, excuse me. This is also parts of a whole, and it can also be structure and function. So I'm trying to create a robot. And if I'm going to create a robot, I really need to be able to understand how those things work together, like how the arm is going to move, right? And I want to make a working robot that has moving pieces. Structure and function is going to be a huge part of that. I also am doing parts of a whole. So this project, they're creating a robot out of recycled materials, things that you can bring from home, like bottle caps and